Let's move on to the sleeves. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take our sleeve panel and we're going to create 2 running stitches that go along from the single notch to the double notches to be able to create shirring. We're also going to end up doing the same thing on the bottom. So the first thing we need to do is take our stitch length and move it to the longest length it can be. You can also reduce the tension if you want to, but I'm just doing moving my stitch width from the normal width to as big of a stitch as it will make, number 5 if you're on the industrial machines. And then I'm going to run 2 running stitches. So first I'm going to do the first stitch at 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to sew that without back stitch. The second row of stitches will be stitched at 5/8 of an inch. So just over a little bit more into the sleeve, leaving the gap in the center, which will be at 1/2 inch, which is where we're going to sew our final stitch. Once we have the running stitches in, we can begin to pull our threads. We can begin to pull the threads and start the shirring so that all of the fullness starts to become in the bottom and in the cap of the sleeve. So once we get that pulled in to our desired measurement, which on the bottom is going to be about 13 inches and on the top about 12 in this area, then we'll get that fullness and we can then equally distribute it, making sure that not all the fullness is, like right now you're seeing this is very flat on this end and very full here. I will want to keep pushing this over until it's nice and even. Once the fullness is to this, has been pulled in, your sleeve should start to look like this. It should have a nice roundness at the top and at the bottom. So the next step will be to switch your machine back to normal stitching, and we're going to sew the underarm seam of the sleeve at 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to go here and sew this at 1/2 inch. Once that seam is sewn, we can also go back and either serge or zigzag that seam allowance so that it won't fray. And then we can trim our threads and we'll be ready to start putting the band onto the sleeve. We'll do the band first and then we'll set the sleeve into the bodice after that. Next, we'll take the band with right sides together and we're going to sew the 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is at the underneath of the band. Now with the band and the sleeve right sides together, we're going to start at the underneath seam and we're going to match that up and pin it. We are going to be sewing on this from the sleeve side where all that shirring is so that we can see what we're doing. So you're going to want to be pinning on the inside side. So now what I'm going to do is pin this around so that matching up the middle point, because we have a middle point here, both marked on our sleeve and on the band. We're going to get this all set up and pinned in so that we can then sew in between the 2 stitches. Now you have all these extra threads, so we're going to want to be careful to try not to sew over them, because if we do, then they're going to get caught up in there and we will be pulling them all out. But if we don't sew over them, it makes the process a little bit easier. So here I'm going to pin my way around, get this ready to sew, and then I will go to the machine and sew in between those 2 lines, and I'll be sewing with a normal stitch. If you find that you need to pull this in a little bit further to make it fit, then you can go back to the threads and you can pull in just a little bit more. Now when I sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, that should take me right down the middle in between those 2 gathering stitches. So I'm going to sew that, permanent stitch, trying to avoid going over the threads. Once you've gone the whole way around, you can flip your piece back to the right side and take a look at it and see that it has a nice equal distribution. So then we can pull out the threads, all these running threads, and mine in blue, of course, so I'm going to take out. And then the next step will be that we're going to finish the bottom of the hem, almost like we do a waistband, where we're going to double roll it up and then stitch it in the ditch. I'll get ready for that next. Now that I've pressed this, I've pressed the seam allowance up, folded the band under, and pinned it, so I'm ready to stitch it. So I have the option here to either stitch it in the ditch like we've done before, or just to edge stitch. And if I'm going to edge stitch, I'll probably want to edge stitch on both ends. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go to my machine, starting at the underneath seam, and I'm going to stitch right just on the edge of that. And then when I finish, I'm going to do the other edge as well. The edge stitch is going to be just one needle space right from the end. Once I've stitched around, I can decide if I want to stitch on the other edge as well. I think I'm choosing now to just leave it like that. So only one stitch will show. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set the sleeve into the bodice. So we need to get our bodice piece back, and then we're going to put the sleeve in. Now, of course, whatever you do here, you're going to do a second time for the other sleeve. Now that we have the front bodice, we're going to see which sleeve we just made. This one has a 1 notch here, so that's the front of the sleeve. So this will be my left sleeve. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start pinning this together so that I can get ready to sew it. So I like to start with the underarm seam. So I'm going to start there and pin it. I'm also going to pin, we have notches on the bodice on the front and the back, and we have the center seam. So we're going to pin all of those things in and make sure the shirring fits. Then the next step is going to be to sew in between those two lines, just like we did on the band, and we're going to do a permanent stitch to hold the sleeve cap in. So we want to make sure it's all pinned around, nice and evenly distributed, and then you're ready to sew. Once we've sewn the whole way around the piece, we're going to go back and inspect to make sure that all the tucks and pleats and shirring is all on the sleeve side, but that the body of the garment does not have any of those. So if it all looks good, then we can remove the stitches again and we can go and press this. So we can remove those stitches and then we can press the seam. Also, we can first we can serge this, or we can zigzag it to make it so that it won't fray. So again, I'm going to zigzag it like I've been on all of my pieces. And now I've taken the sleeve and bodice to the form and put it onto my dress form. So you can see with the V-back, it's looking very nice. So now that I've got that one done and I'm happy with it, I'm going to go on and do the other side, and then we will come back and finish the skirt.